Hey guys, welcome to another edition of Psychology from My Kitchen. This is Mrs. Ryan, and we are continuing with social psychology. And today we are talking about one of our most infamous social psychology experiments that done by Mr. Stanley Milgram. Some background. Stanley Milgram is going to be the child of World War II refugees, and after World War II is finished, you may be familiar with the events surrounding the Nuremberg trials. So, the Nuremberg trials were a series of trials that happened after World War II, in which certain captured Nazi officers were put on trial for war crimes pertaining especially towards the treatment of individuals who were in the concentration camps surrounding Germany. Now, during the Nuremberg trials, the defense that many of these officers put forward was that they were just following orders, that they were doing what they were told to do, that they feared retribution if they did not follow orders, and so that's what they did. And that was just, they weren't the ones who came up with these plans, that they were just carrying out what they were told to do. And as you can imagine, at the time, the general public found this defense to be totally inadequate. You know, you're still an individual person, you can still make choices for yourself. How can you simply state that you were following orders when your orders were to kill innocent people? And so, this is largely unaccepted by the general populace. But not Solomon Asch. So Stanley Milgram takes this idea and he says, well, could that really be a thing? Like, is that something that, a reason why people are going to commit these heinous acts? And so he is going to create an experiment that is looking at a social psychology concept of obedience and whether or not a person is going to be obedient or not. So Stanley Milgram is going to set up an experiment in which he has participants coming in, studying the idea of whether or not pain can teach someone information. Now, they think that the other person that is involved in the experiment is a participant when in fact they're an actor. They're another Confederate that is in on the experiment. So the participant is assigned the role of teacher, and the other person is assigned the role of learner. And the idea is that the teacher is going to read aloud certain word pairings, and that the learner needs to guess the correct answer. If they guess the correct answer, they're able to move on. But if they guess an incorrect response, then they're going to be given a low voltage shock. Now, this low voltage shock, however, is going to increase in voltage with the number of missed responses or incorrect responses, all the way up to the point in which the person would be administering lethal electric shocks to the person who's been assigned the learner. Now, what they also did was they put the teacher and learner into two separate spaces. So the teacher can't see the learner, but they can hear them, or at least they think they're hearing them. In fact, because the learner isn't really being shocked, and that's an important point, no one's actually getting hurt in this experiment. What they're playing is an audio recording of a person giving responses and then also giving responses of pain if they have been quote unquote shocked, even though, again, that didn't really happen. So a lot of people thought that, no one's going to go along with purposefully shocking someone because they got a wrong answer. That seems silly. That seems ridiculous. How could anybody do that? Why would you obey someone who's asking you to kill another person who's done nothing wrong? That seems absolutely ridiculous. Uh, well, so when it actually came to it, a large chunk of participants actually administered what they thought were these lethal doses of electricity to an innocent person, simply because there was a person in a lab coat who was in the room with them. And if they told them that they, didn't think they should go on, they'd be like, oh, well, you need to continue. The experiment requires you to continue. They never told them that they could never stop, but their presence of authority made them believe that they needed to obey. And this was really fascinating research. Now, we know today that this would be considered highly unethical because even though no one technically gets hurt, you're making people believe that they are in fact hurting someone. And we kind of think of that as a big no today. But it still gives us this kind of fascinating look at obedience and how far are we willing to obey an authority figure. So first of all, we know that obedience is going to be much higher if certain conditions are met. So one of them is that a legitimate authority is close by. So if whomever you consider to be an authority in the particular situation, if they are in the vicinity, if they are in the room, they can be seen and they're a legitimate authority, you're going to obey, or at least you're much more likely to obey that person. When you think that that authority figure is supported by some sort of prestigious institution, a prestigious organization, that they have some kind of backing that makes them more likely to be an authority, that again you're more likely to obey them. When your victim is depersonalized, especially at a distance. So this is a really interesting one about obedience, especially in terms of being obedient towards harming another person. If in Milgram's experiment, if what he had done is having the teacher and the learner in the same space, and that the teacher is actually seeing what they're doing, they're actually less likely going to obey. But because they didn't see that person, well, they're no longer a person. It's just this voice that I'm hearing. It becomes depersonalized. This is a major aspect that is used in a lot of war. Again, going back to World War II, that in persons who were eliminated in the war. So when you look at these undesirable persons, they were political opponents, they were people who identified as homosexual, people who were gypsies, and of course the Jewish population, that all of these individuals prior to this final solution were all made out to being depersonalized in some way, that by playing up on prejudices and biases towards these group of people, they become less of a person and someone you would be more likely or more willing to potentially hurt. In fact, even in our vernacular, that when we talk about the elimination of the Jewish population, a lot of people will use the terminology of extermination, which extermination, what is it that you exterminate? You exterminate bugs and rodents and vermin. And so when you say something like exterminating the Jews during the Holocaust, you're actually perpetuating the depersonalization of this group of people. And that's exactly what happens in Fang's obedience. That if my victim is someone that I don't really even think of as a person, then I'm much more willing to obey and to go along with potentially hurting this person. As well as the fact when there are no role models for defiance. Something that is often not depicted as well or not as well understood about World War II is the concept that there were some major political opponents and uprisings that were involved in the Holocaust, especially. That there were major forms of resistance that in fact occurred. However, they were significantly downplayed, especially by media groups at the time. That one of the first groups of people who were taken into concentration camps were the rabble rousers, the people who would be more likely to be defiant. And so because they're the ones who are taken first, political opponents, people who are well educated or well influential towards other groups of people, they are a role model for defiance. And so if I want people to comply, to obey with my demands, then I'm going to do my best to rid of role models who would potentially be defiant. And in fact, in Milgram's experiment, when our teacher is alone in the room besides this supposed authority figure, they don't have anybody around them saying, like, I don't think we should do this anymore. Oh, really? I don't think we should do this either. And then boom, they both stop. When you don't have that kind of support, you're more likely going to continue to obey. So what Milgram's experiment and what a lot of social psychology is ultimately able to tell us is that when we think about others committing atrocious acts against another person, somebody being violent, somebody being horrible towards another person, being antisocial is really the behavior that we call it, that it doesn't mean that this person is inherently bad. It's that the situation that they have been put in has corrupted them. And while that tends to conflict with our beliefs about how we have individual autonomy and that we make our own choices, social psychology is really telling us that there's a whole lot of influence that happens on our person when it comes to outside people. So that's going to be it for social psychology today. Until next time, you guys take care.